God that prophet Isaiah, the Lord, who are the gospel of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Now again, Jesus left the district of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, to the district of the Decapolis. And people brought him a deaf man who had a speech impediment, and they begged Jesus to lay his hands upon him. Jesus took him off by himself, away from the crowd. He put his finger into the man's ears and, spitting, touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and he groaned, and he said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened and his speech impediment was removed, and he spoke plainly. Now Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them not to, the more they proclaimed it. They were exceedingly astonished, and they said, He has done all things well. He makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. The Gospel of the Lord. Amen. To understand what the Scriptures are trying to tell us today, I want to begin with a riddle. And if you know it, don't whisper the answer to your neighbor. And the riddle goes like this. There was a father and a son who were driving along and were in a terrible car accident. And the father was immediately killed. And they rushed the son off to the hospital, and as they were wheeling him into the operating room, the surgeon looked down and said, I can't operate on this child. This is my son. The father has died. How can this be? Let that roll around a little bit today, because I think it bespeaks of what we need to hear, that all three authors, Isaiah and James and Jesus, are trying to tell us today, because the goal of our life, as I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, isn't just to get to heaven. We are not a funereal society. The goal of our life is to live in the kingdom right here, right now. But there are obstacles that keep us from entering fully. And what the authors are trying to do is to remove those obstacles from our eyes and from our ears, that we may hear the voice of God and see, well, as we're celebrating about creation all this month, the glory of God's presence in all of creation. But the obstacles have to be removed. If something is blocking the eye cannot see until it is removed. And once it's removed, you can see not just with the physical eye, but with the eye of the mind, and ultimately the eye of the soul. The same thing with the ear. Once the ear is unblocked, you begin to hear. Now, Isaiah starts by telling us the situation. He said, say to those who are frightened. Who's that? We live in an age of fear. If there is anything that is pumped upon us because they want to control us, it's to make us afraid, very much afraid. Afraid of who? Afraid of the other. Afraid of the other gender, afraid of the other color, afraid of the other ethnicity, afraid of the other religion, afraid of the other. And once you have them afraid, well, then you can control them, because you've got them at each other's throats. They don't trust anybody else. They can't see anybody else. They can't hear anybody else. Divide and conquer is the way of the world. Well, Isaiah comes and says, don't do that. Say to those who are be frightened, don't be afraid. As a matter of fact, in every theophany, every time God appears, especially through one of the angels, the first thing out of the mouth of the angel is, don't be afraid. Kind of makes you wonder what the angel looks like, huh? Ooh. Don't be afraid. God is with you. Say to those who are frightened, be strong, fear not. Here is your God. They tell us that the most traumatic experience we have ever gone through or will go through in our life is our birth. We are one with our mother. We hear her heartbeat, and then all of a sudden, when the time comes, we are thrown out of that wonderful, warm womb into the cold, damp air, and the first thing we do is scream. We cry. We've been separated from the source of life. We want that source of life. And so the second thing that happens is that the baby is immediately put to its mother's breast, and the baby begins to hear the heartbeat of her mother. And the two hearts are beating as one. She has now been reconnected to the source. And as she is reconnected to the source, she can open her eyes and begin to see the world around her. Oh, say to those who are frightened, be strong, fear not, here is your God. He comes with vindication. And then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unplugged. And we shall see our God in all of creation and hear his voice as he speaks. But there's a problem. We don't see clearly. We don't hear clearly. And I'm afraid the cacophony of the voices of fear have spoken so loudly that we begin to believe them. We have a real hard time in believing in this amazing grace that we are swimming in, but we are unaware of it because we are gripped by this fear and by our own blindness, and we are all blind. Because in reality, we do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. All of us have blind spots. All of us are deaf to certain things that are being spoken. If you don't believe me, talk to one of your adolescent kids someday. Talk to the wall. And yet, the words come out, they're just not heard because they are blocked. That's the problem that James has today in the second reading. He's dealing with people's blind spots and their prejudgments. And here's their prejudgment. Their prejudgment is if you're dressed nice and if you're rich, that it may rub off on me, so I want to get close to you. And James says, look at what you're doing. You're not really seeing. All you're seeing is what's external. And you are attracted to it, and you think you're going to get it. So if a rich man walks in with the gold and all that wonderful stuff, you say, oh, come and sit over here next to me. Come to the head of the table. And then if a person who is shabbily dressed comes in, you go, oh, sit over there. You can eat the leftovers when you got time. Have you not discriminated in your heart? Have you not been blind? Because here's what you're blind to. And he's going to make explicit what's implicit. You're blind to the reality that is right before you. And here's the reality. Did not God make the poor rich in mercy and grace and the kingdom of God? If you want this fullness of life, don't think it's going to trickle down. Trickle down does not work real well. If you want the fullness of life, it's going to have to bubble up. And where does it bubble up from? It bubbles up from the bottom. It's the great paradox of our faith. If you want to find, you have to lose. If you want to live, you have to die. If you want to be rich, go to the poor. Why? That doesn't seem to make sense. Well, the rich can take care of themselves. Thank you very much. They are entities all by themselves. They don't need anything extra. The poor know that they need. And there was a baby priest in my all-black parish in Hopkins Park. The first prayer that ever came out of the mouth of our people was always the same. Every day, I praise God that I woke up in my right mind this morning. Now that's a prayer. That's a wonderful prayer. And so James is trying to remove their blinders and help them to see. And of course we say, well, we don't have any blinders. We protest. We're not prejudiced people. Well, we are. All of us have a bias. As a matter of fact, what James was teaching 2,000 years ago has been scientifically proven today. At Harvard, they've been doing some incredible studies on what's called implicit bias. And we all have implicit biases, which means that we don't see the whole picture. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. And how are we? Well, we're white, we're middle class, we live in suburbia, we've got a certain income, we've got a certain point of view. Every point of view is a view from a point, which means we don't get the whole picture. And so the authors of the implicit bias studies say you've got to open your eyes to see what is really there. They did one study on Airbnb, the place where you go get your housing from somebody else's house, and they had noticed that 20% of African Americans who applied for places in New York City for Airbnb were rejected. And they don't always put pictures up, so they wonder, how did they get rejected so? And of course, the people who were bringing them in said, well, no, we're not prejudiced. We'll take everybody. However, you're going to have a much harder time getting your Airbnb house if your name is Tamisha Jones. Just change it to Tammy Jones, and you're going to be home free. We don't see that. The thing about an implicit bias is that it's unconscious. So in one way, we're not responsible for our unconscious biases until they are brought to the fore. One of the teachers at Harvard, when in trying to bring that to the fore, was use that example of the Airbnb. And one of the students in the back of the room, who was pudgy-faced, round pudgy-faced and bald, said, listen, I don't care. I will choose who I want in my house and who I don't want in my house. That's my decision. She says, you're absolutely right. That's your decision. And as I am hiring you, I refuse to hire anybody with round, pudgy faces and balding heads. By the way, that wasn't me. Right? I'm not going to hire them. It's very interesting right now, the big orchestras, when they audition people for their orchestra, do it behind a curtain. And the reason they do it that way is because they know they have implicit biases. Otherwise, they would have never hired the world's best tuba player who's a woman. It doesn't fit. It doesn't go together. Now back to the riddle. The riddle goes like this. A father and son are out driving. They're in a terrible car accident. The father is killed, and the son is rushed to the hospital. And as he's wheeled into the operating room, the surgeon looks down and says, I can't operate on this child. This is my son. Now, I banged my head, and I finally came up with a solution. Well, obviously, the father was the stepfather that he was driving with, and the surgeon was the birth father. Well, that's not the solution at all. Who knows what the solution was? The surgeon was his mother. I could have had a V8. Huh? The surgeon was his mother. Now, when she told that story, there was a girl in her class who went like this. She started banging her head on her desk. And after class, she said, I think that's a bit of an overreaction. Don't beat yourself up. She said, no, you don't understand. You don't understand. My mother's a surgeon. And I didn't get it. That's implicit bias. And it's hidden. And our job and the job of the scriptures and what Jesus is trying to do today is to make explicit what is implicit. Because it's never going to go away until it's brought to light. By the way, if you're interested in finding out what some of your implicit biases are, you can go online and just type in implicit.harvard.edu, and they got all kinds of little tests, some on religion, some on politics, some on ethnicity and culture, to find out where your own implicit biases are. And we've all got them. Because our ears are plugged and our eyes are blind. Now it's not we're not responsible for it until it's brought to consciousness. But we are responsible to bring to consciousness all that is hidden, all that makes us deaf. Today, Jesus has brought a man who is deaf, cannot hear. And if you cannot hear, then you cannot speak. Everybody sounds like something out of a Peanut cartoon when the adults are speaking. Wah, wee, wah, wah, wah. You can't, nothing's going to come out. Nothing's going to come out. And so they and what's the first thing Jesus does? I love this. Takes them off. Come here. Because you are not going to hear anything with the cacophony that's going on around you. We live in a cacophony of noise. We live in the noisiest environment in the world. He's taking him off by himself. He's taking him to a place where there's a possibility of hearing. We cannot hear and we cannot see unless we take that contemplative stance that allows us to see all the way through and to hear that still, small voice of God that Elijah heard on the mountain. And so he takes them off by himself where there is no noise, where there is no distraction. That's the reason they're forever going out into the desert. And he does some, I love this. And he spits on his fingers, okay? Putting a little divine DNA on his fingers. Could you imagine if Jesus mailed in his DNA to Ancestry.com? Yeah. Part Jew, a little bit of Samaritan. I bet you Samaritan in there, whole bunch of God, all right? So he's spitting this divine DNA and he's plugging them in. He's plugging them into the ears of the fellow who's deaf. Almost like an antenna, like he's trying to make contact with the source, putting the baby back on its mother's breast so he can hear the heartbeat, plugging up his ears so that when they're opened, he can hear the voice of God, and he screams out, he groans. Ephphatha, he uses the original Aramaic, one of the few places that the Aramaic is used. Ephphatha, be opened. And his ears were opened, and he heard. What did he hear? What did he hear? You know, the king of France was all upset with Joan of Arc, and he says, you know what? You're a little peasant girl, and God speaks to you. You hear the voice of God. I'm the king of France. I've never heard the voice of God. She says, oh, your majesty. Of course you hear it. You've just never listened. Of course we hear it. The divine conversation between our God and ourselves is God who always, always, always speaks first. Of course you hear it. But we're never in an environment to hear it. We're never alone by ourselves. But once we hear it, once the implicit is made explicit, we begin to see. We see through the eyes of the Christ. We hear the voice of his Father speaking the only word he knows how to say, and that's, I love you. And we can do what Mother Teresa was able to do at the end of her life. At the end of her life, Mother Teresa would go all over the world, and she says, you know, everywhere I go, I see people. I don't see black people, I don't see white people, I don't see genders, I don't see ethnicity, I don't see political, I just see people. Now that's seeing things as they are, not as we are. Those are the eyes of the Christ. Those are the ears of the Christ. We are called all to seek them both.